The carriage hit the rut at full gallop, and Edmund felt the rear axle crack a heartbeat before the world tilted. He grabbed for the strap above the door, missed, and was thrown shoulder first into the opposite wall as the whole vehicle lurched sideways into the mud of the Yorkshire road. Somewhere outside, his coachman shouted. A short, brutal word the storm tore in half, and the horses screamed and bolted free of their traces with a sound like cloth ripping. Edmund hit the floor of the cabin, found his feet, and shoved the door open into a wall of rain so dense it felt like grain pouring from a sack. He had been racing this storm for 3 hours, and a promise for 3 days. The signed marriage settlement was folded inside his coat over his heart, the wax seal still warm when he had left London at dawn. Lady Cordelia Pembroke's name was written beside his, in his own steady hand. The vows were set for the 2nd of November. His mother had asked him to make this match for the dukedom, for the estate, for the 700 tenants whose roofs his father had let go to rot. He had said yes. He had given his word. He had ridden north in a hired post-chaise, because his own dukedom's carriage was at the wheelwrights, and now this hired chaise lay tilted in a ditch on a moor he could not name, and the only promise the storm seemed willing to honour was the one it was making to drown him before midnight. "Your Grace!" His coachman, Brennan, came staggering around the side of the carriage, hatless, his livery black with rain. He took one look at the cracked axle and swore again with the comfortable familiarity of a man who had been Edmund's coachman for 9 years and considered it part of the wage. "How bad?" Edmund said. He had to shout. The rain in his hair was running into his collar and down his back already. "Bad!" Brennan shouted back. "Wheels split. Axle's gone. The mares are halfway to Halifax by now, the cowards." He shouted across the wind to ask how far it was to the nearest house. 4 miles back to the village we passed at the 3rd milepost. Or—" Brennan pointed up the road with one rain-blackened arm. "Half a mile that way. There's a coaching inn, the White Stag. Old place. Lights on." Edmund peered into the dark. He could just make out, through the lashing curtain, the small, steady wink of a window where there ought to have been only more. "Then we walk to the White Stag," he said. "You walk, Your Grace. I'll stay with the chaise and the bags." Edmund warned him he would catch a chill that would put him in bed for a week. Brennan answered that he had a flask, and Edmund did not, and to be on his way. Edmund did not argue. He pulled the chaise door fully open, dragged out the small leather case that held the marriage settlement and his own correspondence, tucked it beneath his arm under his greatcoat, and set off up the road at a pace just short of a run. The wind hit him like a hand against the chest. He bent his head and kept walking. The road was a river of black water, flecked white where the wind whipped it. His boots, handmade London soft Spanish leather, filled in the first 30 paces and never emptied again. He could feel the wet seeping up his calves under the buckskin. The promise inside his coat was wrapped in oilcloth. He had wrapped it himself. He had not, at the time, imagined that the promise might be the only dry thing left on him by the time he reached shelter. The window grew. A square of warm yellow, then a low stone shape beneath it, then the painted swing of a sign, a white stag in a green field, the gilt all but gone, the words, "The White Stag," still legible if you knew what to look for. Edmund staggered up the last few yards of mud, climbed the 2 stone steps, and was reaching for the iron knocker when the door opened from the inside. The woman who stood there held a lantern in one hand and a long iron poker in the other, and Edmund's first thought, through cold and exhaustion and the sheer animal relief of seeing light, was that he had never in his life seen such an unreasonable face standing behind a poker. She was tall for a woman, with her dark hair pinned up in a way that had given up on neatness an hour ago, 3 or 4 chestnut strands plastered to the side of her throat by the damp of the doorway. Her eyes were grey and very awake. Her mouth was set in a level line that had nothing apologetic in it. She wore a plain dress the colour of moss, the cuffs turned back to her elbows, and the lantern threw a warm gold over the angle of her cheek and the curve of her throat, in a way the painters of London would have ruined a year of canvas to catch, and ruined in the catching. She might have been 26. She was, Edmund thought with the part of his brain that was still functioning, unsettlingly beautiful in the way of women who have stopped expecting anyone to notice. "Are you a customer?" she said, "or a thief?" Edmund tried to answer and discovered his teeth had begun to chatter. She looked him up and down once, a clean appraisal, no shyness in it, and lowered the poker. "Customer," she decided. "No thief stands on a doorstep in this weather. They go round the back. Come inside before you fall down in my doorway, sir. I don't want the constable out at dawn." "My carriage," he managed. "Down the road, I'd guess. I heard the axle go." He asked, somewhat thrown, whether she had heard it. "In a storm like this, you hear everything. Come in." She stepped back. He stepped in. The door shut behind him with a thump that took the wind off his back in a single blessed instant. And he stood in a low-beamed tap room with a peat fire going at one end, 4 empty tables, a stairway to his right, and a smell of beeswax and wood smoke and something. Bread? Recently baked. He was shaking so hard the leather case judded against his ribs. "Stand there," she ordered. "Don't drip on the rug." He started to protest that he was already dripping. "Stand on the flags. Yes, there." She set the lantern on the bar, propped the poker against the wall, keeping it within arm's reach, he noted, with the steady practicality of a woman who lived alone, and crossed to the fire to add a fresh peat. The flames licked up. She turned back. "Coat off, boots off, sit by the fire. I'll bring you something dry." He began to refuse the order. "You don't argue with the only person between you and pneumonia. Sit." He sat. He pulled off his greatcoat, heavy as a wet horse, and let it fall on the flagstones in a slap of water. He worked the boots off and set them, one beside the other, on the hearthstone. His stockings were the colour of soaked tobacco. He peeled them too. He sat in his shirt and breeches and waistcoat, the leather case across his lap like a child, and watched the woman move about her own room with the brisk economy of someone who had not been served by anyone but herself in a long time. She came back with a folded heap of clean linen, a man's shirt, a wool blanket, and a pair of knitted stockings the colour of oatmeal. "My husband's," she said, putting the bundle on the table beside him. "Before you ask. He was your height, less in the shoulder. They'll fit close. There's a passage behind the bar, door on the left. That's the keeping room. You can change there in private. Don't go up the stairs. Those are my rooms. I shall be at the fire." "Was," Edmund said before he could stop himself. "He was buried 2 years ago October. Cholera. Bad water. Are you going to fall over in my taproom, or are you going to put on the shirt, sir?" Edmund chose the shirt. She approved the choice without comment beyond a nod. He carried the bundle to the keeping room, small, lime-washed, a window blocked with a sack against the rain, and changed in the dark. The shirt was rougher linen than he had worn in 15 years, and he could not remember the last time clean cloth had felt so close to a miracle. The wool stockings were dry. He drew the blanket around his shoulders and came back into the taproom looking, he suspected, like a shipwrecked vicar. The woman was crouched at the fire, setting a kettle on the iron hook over the peat. She glanced up. "Better," she said. "Sit, I'll do tea. Whiskey later. What's your name, sir?" He had thought about it on the cold walk up the road, between the 3rd and the 4th lungfuls of horizontal rain. He had thought about it the way a man thinks about a hand of cards he doesn't intend to play. A duke does not give his title to a woman alone in an inn at midnight in a storm. Not because of any social rule, but because of practical sense. A title invites flattery, and flattery he could not bear tonight. He wanted to be a man for 1 hour. 1 hour in a warm room with a woman who was not pricing his coat with her eyes. "Edmund Carmichael," he said. It was true. It was his family name beneath the title. "From London, travelling north on business." She straightened. The grey eyes rested on him a fraction of a second longer than the answer required. "Imogen Hartley," she said. "I keep the inn. Welcome to the White Stag, Mr. Carmichael. We are, at present, full only of weather." She had heard the pause before his answer. He saw it in the way her mouth moved at one corner. Not quite a smile, more a private acknowledgement, as if she were filing his name beside his stockings on a shelf of things to be reconsidered later. But she did not press. She poured boiling water into a brown earthenware pot, set out 2 thick cups, and brought one to him without asking whether he wanted it. "Drink that, then we'll see about your coachman." "Brennan. He's with the chaise, half a mile back." "Then I'll send Tom out to fetch him. Tom's the stable lad. He's 12 and immortal." She crossed to a small door behind the bar and opened it onto a passage. "Tom!" Her voice was a clean, carrying call, no shouting in it. A boy's voice answered. There were brief instructions: coachman, white stag lantern, oilskin, the chestnut cob in the second stall, no nonsense. And then she shut the door and came back and stood with her hands at her hips by the fire. "He's gone. Brennan will be here in the half hour. Now drink your tea, Mr. Carmichael, and tell me what business has driven a man in soft boots up a moor road in a storm in October." Edmund looked into his cup. The tea was nearly black and smelled of orange peel. He had not had tea this good at his club. "I am returning to my estate," he said after a moment. It was, again, true. "I came up from London this morning. I was to be home by nightfall." She observed that it had been unwise. He agreed that the point had been established. She asked where home was. "Carmichael, near Helmsley. A day's ride further north if the roads are dry. 2 if they are not." She nodded slowly. "I know the name. Old house. The Dowager Lady Carmichael had her still-room famous up here. My mother used to talk of her recipe for ginger cordial." "My grandmother," Edmund said, and tasted the truth on his tongue, and discovered it cost him nothing. "And you are her grandson, and you are travelling alone in a hired chaise from London in October with, what, a leather case clutched to your ribs like the world depends on it?" He almost laughed. "Something like that?" She sat down at the table opposite him at last and poured herself a cup. "Well, Mr. Carmichael of Carmichael near Helmsley, the road won't dry before tomorrow at earliest. The wheelwright in Stainforth is 2 miles north, and he is sober only on Wednesdays. Today is Friday, so he won't take iron in his hand until Tuesday. Your coachman will sleep in my stable. You will sleep in the small guest room above the parlour. The fire will be kept up. The tea will be paid in coin tomorrow morning at fair rate. The shirt is a gift. I have no use for it. Are we agreed?" He told her they were entirely agreed. "And whatever business is in that case will keep until the storm passes. Yes?" "Good. Then drink." She raised her own cup. Her eyes met his over the rim, direct, grey, faintly amused, faintly something else he could not read because he had not earned the right to read it yet. "2 axles," she said, "and the inns they ruin on their way to bed." He drank. He woke at first light, into a room so quiet he thought for one bewildered instant that the storm had taken his hearing with it. It had not. The wind had simply moved on. Through the small leaded window he could see a hard grey sky stretched flat across a moor of bracken and dripping heather, and a stone wall, and beyond the wall, a single rook beating slowly westward against a wind that was now only ordinary. The world was rinsed. The world was also, he realized, holding a kettle to its lip and steaming softly downstairs, because he could smell the porridge. He lay still for a long moment beneath the wool counterpane in the borrowed shirt and let yesterday come back to him in pieces. The signed settlement, the crack of the axle, the shape of her in the doorway with the poker. Cordelia. He sat up. He drew a long breath. He looked at the leather case set carefully on the chair by the wall, and he set his bare feet on the cold floorboards, and he got dressed. In the tap room, Imogen Hartley was wiping down the bar. Brennan, his coachman, was sitting at the corner table in a borrowed jersey 3 sizes too small, eating porridge with the focused gratitude of a man who had spent a night convinced the cattle barn would be his coffin. Brennan started to speak with the formal address. Edmund coughed. Hard. He turned the cough into something almost like a sneeze, met Brennan's eyes across the room, and made the very small, private gesture that 9 years of service had taught Brennan to read on the instant. Brennan blinked. Brennan rallied. Brennan said, smoothly, "Mr. Carmichael, I trust you slept well?" Imogen, polishing the same square of bar a beat longer than necessary, did not look up. "I did, Brennan. Eat your porridge. How is the chaise?" "Wheel and axle gone, sir. Tom and I dragged her clear of the ditch at first light. She's against Mrs. Hartley's stable wall. Wheelwright's in Stainforth, 2 miles. Won't come till Tuesday." Edmund repeated the word back to him without inflection. Brennan added, in the tone of a man delivering a small kindness, that today was Friday. Edmund told him, dry as toast, that he could still count days. Imogen set the cloth down. "Porridge for you, Mr. Carmichael, before you starve standing up. Honey on the table, cream in the jug, tea in the pot. Sit." He sat. He ate. Brennan, between mouthfuls, gave a creditable account of the night. Tom's gallant rescue, the cob's patience, the chaise's indignity, and Imogen made him repeat the part about Tom standing on the box, swinging a lantern over his head like a herald, and laughed. And the laugh was a low, quick sound that surprised her as much as it surprised Edmund. She put her hand to her own mouth, as if to check the laugh had not damaged anything, and Edmund watched the colour come up under her cheekbones and thought, with the calm of a man who has not yet begun to lie to himself, "I am in trouble." After breakfast, Brennan went out to the stable. Edmund stood in the tap room with his hands in his pockets and his greatcoat, dry now, draped over a chairback near the fire, and tried to look like a man with a plan. "You are not going anywhere on foot, Mr. Carmichael," Imogen said from behind the bar. He said he was aware. "And Stainforth will not begin to bend iron before Tuesday." He said he was aware of that as well. "You will therefore," she said, taking up an iron pail and a folded sack, "make yourself useful. The storm took half the slate off the stable roof. Tom is 12 and immortal, but he is not tall. Brennan tells me you climb." Edmund stared at her. "You're hiring me," he said slowly, "to mend your roof." "I am offering you," she replied, "the dignity of a guest who pays his way. 3 nights, 3 meals a day, a roof over the cob. In exchange, slates, and whatever else falls off this house in the next 4 days, which, on past form, will be considerable." "I am a duke," he thought. "I am a guest who pays his way," he said. "Good answer. Pail, sack, boots, yours are dry. The ladder is round the back. Brennan can hold the foot. I shall be in the kitchen with the bread." He carried the pail and the sack out into the wet grey morning, and as he ducked under the low lintel of the door, he heard her say, low, behind him, "You are a very strange sort of London man, Mr. Carmichael." He did not turn around. He thought, "Yes, madam, I am." The roof took most of the morning. It was not unpleasant work. Edmund had not laid slate since he was 16, when his father had decided, in one of his sober years, that the heir to a dukedom ought to know what the men on his estate did for him, and had set him for a fortnight on the roof of a tenant's cottage with old Pritchett, the slater. Edmund had hated his father most of his life. He had loved old Pritchett. The lessons had stuck. He could pin a slate to a batten with 3 nails in the dark. By mid-morning the wind had dropped to a steady whisper, and the sun, very pale, was trying out the moor in patches. Brennan, holding the ladder at the foot, kept up a low stream of commentary on the chaise, the wheelwright, the weather, and, once, the unsettling competence of their hostess. "Sir," Brennan said quietly, when Edmund came down for more slates, "the lady is, I take it, not to be apprised." "She is not," Edmund said, equally quietly. "Not yet." Brennan accepted the correction without argument. "How long, Brennan, in your professional estimation?" "Until Tuesday, sir. The wheelwright is not negotiable." Edmund thought, looking up at the half-mended roof and the grey sky, and the cobs steaming in the paddock behind the stable, of Cordelia Pembroke, in her father's drawing-room in London, waiting for word that he was safely home in Carmichael to begin posting the banns. "Then we have 4 days," he said. He went back up the ladder. At 1 o'clock, Imogen came out into the yard with a basket and a mug. She set them on the stone bench by the door. "Cheese!" she called up, hand shading her eyes. "And bread! And the dregs of yesterday's cider, which is better than the dregs of today's tea. Come down before you fall." He came down. He drank the cider standing in the yard, with his hair full of stone dust, and she stood 3 paces from him in a clean apron, and looked at him with the same level grey assessment she had used the night before, and he thought, again, and this time more grimly, "I am in trouble." She remarked on the state of his hands. He looked at them. The left palm had a long red graze. He had not noticed. He told her it was nothing. "It is something. Come inside. I have a salve." He began to insist that he did not require help. "Inside, or I shall send you out to the cob for fly ointment, and that smells worse." He followed her inside. The kitchen, past the taproom, down 2 steps, low-beamed and warm, was lined with shelves of jars. He had a sudden, absurd thought. His grandmother's still-room, the one Mrs. Hartley's mother had spoken of. The same arrangement, even. Herbs by alphabet, tinctures on the high shelves, beeswax candles in a wooden box by the hearth, an apothecary's brass scale on the deal table by the window. The room had a smell that took him directly to his childhood. Rosemary, beeswax, and something sharper underneath. Comfrey, or borage, or both. "You make these," he said. She said she did. He pressed, asking whether all of them were her work. "Most. Some I trade for. The arnica is dear. I grow what I can. My mother taught me. Her mother taught her. The old Lady Carmichael, your grandmother, taught my grandmother by all accounts. The world is smaller than London likes to pretend." She poured warm water into a basin from the kettle, took down a small, dark jar, and beckoned him to a stool. He sat. She drew his hand into her own, her fingers cool, her own palms surprisingly calloused, and washed the graze, and dabbed on the salve, and bound it with a strip of clean linen, all in silence. She did not look up at him while she worked. He looked at the part in her hair instead. He could see one fine silvering thread above her left ear. She was, he revised, perhaps 27. She moved like a woman who had been a wife and a widow, and the keeper of her own house in turn. "There," she said, tying off the linen. "Stay out of the lime mortar for an hour." He found his voice with some difficulty. She waited, hands quiet at her apron, for him to use it. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley." "You are welcome, Mr. Carmichael." She let go of his hand. The graze was still warm under the linen, but the warmer thing, and he was honest enough, even in that moment, to know it, was the place at his wrist, where her thumb had rested for half a second longer than the bandage strictly required. She turned to put the jar back on the shelf. He stood up. He looked at the brass scale by the window, and at the back of her head, and at the small, steady drip of the kettle into the bowl, and he wished, with a clarity that startled him, that he were, in fact, a Mr. Carmichael, from London, on business, of no consequence, and free. "More slates after lunch," he said. "More slates after lunch," she agreed. He carried his cider back out to the yard. That afternoon, Tom came running into the yard with mud on his knees and a face the colour of skimmed milk. "Mr. Carmichael, sir! It's the bay mare! She's gone down in the second stall!" Edmund was up the ladder with a chisel in his hand. He came down it in 3 steps and was across the yard before Tom had finished speaking. Brennan was already at the stable door. The bay mare, one of Imogen's 2, was on her side in the straw, with her ribs heaving and her dark eye rolled white at the corner. She had been off her feed since Thursday, Tom said, and Mrs. Hartley had been physicking her with a warm bran mash and a tincture of gentian. And now this. "Colic," Brennan said grimly. "How long has she been down?" "Quarter of an hour, sir. She tried to roll, sir. I held her." "Good lad. Mrs. Hartley?" She was already there, beside him on her knees in the straw, with a basin of warm water and a small dark bottle, her sleeves pushed up past her elbows, her hair coming down the side of her throat in the way it did when she had stopped paying it any attention. She did not look at Edmund. She put her hand on the mare's flank and spoke to her, low, by name. Hyacinth. And the mare's ear flickered. She uncorked the bottle. The smell was sharp and green and old-fashioned. Turpentine and something else. "You hold her head, Edmund. Brennan, the lead rope from the post, quick. Tom, the second pail, walking water. Now." Edmund went down on his knees by the mare's head and laid his hands on her, one at the side of her jaw, one along the bridge of her nose, and spoke to her the way he had been speaking to horses since he was 4. She fixed him with one wet, dark eye, and did not, mercifully, thrash. Imogen worked. He had not, in 3 days, seen her work at anything she cared about for as long as the mare took to ease. He watched her hands, the small grazes on the knuckles, the broken nail on the left forefinger, the quick, certain way she measured drops from the bottle into the basin. She poured the dose herself between the mare's teeth, holding the soft lip back with 2 fingers. She did not flinch. She talked. She did not stop talking. She named every part of the mare she was touching as she touched it, the way nurses speak to patients they have decided are going to live whether they wish to or not. After 10 minutes, Hyacinth gave a deep, shuddering sigh and let go of a great cloud of warm horse breath that smelled of bran and apple, and her tense flank went soft beneath Imogen's hand. "There," Imogen said quietly. "Yes, good girl. Good. Up now." She got Hyacinth onto her feet between them, Imogen at the halter, Edmund at the haunch, Brennan at the rope, and they walked the mare slowly around the stable in a long oval for nearly an hour while the gentian did its work. By the time the mare was easy again and willing to drink, the light had gone out of the high stable window, and the rooks had come in over the wall to roost. "Brennan, take her into the back stall. Walk her once more in half an hour. Tom, the warm mash, no oats." "Yes, Mrs. Hartley." She turned. She and Edmund were standing in the dim stable, in the smell of horse and warm straw and turpentine, and she had hay in her hair, and a streak of something dark down the front of her apron, and she looked at him in the low light, with the directness that had not left her since the night she had stood in the doorway with the poker. She said his name. He answered her. That was kind. It was not kind, it was a horse. It was kind to a horse. It is, on the whole, a thing I've learnt to attend to about a man. She lifted one hand. He thought, for a sharp, clean instant, that she was about to lay it against his face, the way she had laid the linen against his palm in the kitchen. She did not. She brushed a piece of straw from the shoulder of his shirt and dropped it to the floor. "There. Go and wash. Supper in 20 minutes. He went and washed. His hands were not quite steady at the pump. Supper was a slow business. Imogen brought up a bottle of claret from the small cellar. The last of John's. He meant it for a Christmas he never reached. And they ate at the long table by the fire, with Brennan and Tom at the far end, and the two of them at the near, and the talk drifted from horses to weather to the Dowager Lady Carmichael's old ginger cordial recipe, which Imogen could recite from memory, and which Edmund's own grandmother had, by every appearance, taught the village schoolmaster's wife exactly 38 years ago, in a kitchen not unlike this one. "It is strange," Edmund said, "to sit at a table in a house I have never been in, and find that my grandmother has been here before me." Houses, she answered, were smaller than they seemed in the country. The world also. After supper, Brennan and Tom went out to the stable. Imogen poured the last of the claret into Edmund's cup and her own, and sat in the chair opposite his with her stockinged feet drawn up under her. The fire was low. The candle on the table between them was burned to 2/3. She had taken her cap off. Her hair was down past her shoulders in a long, heavy plait, the colour of wet bark. She named him gravely. He answered with the careful courtesy of a guest. After a moment, she set her cup down and asked him for one true thing about himself as payment for the claret. He thought, looking into the fire. "When I was 9, he said slowly, my father, who was not a kind man, broke a pony of mine in a way I will not describe. I went into the loose box afterwards with the pony, and I cried for an hour in the straw. My mother found me. She did not, on the whole, attend to her children much. She came in, and she sat in the straw beside me, in a dove silk morning gown, and she put her hand on the back of my neck, and she said one sentence to me which I have not, since, repeated to any living person. She said—" He stopped. "You needn't," she said. "Edmund, there are men who break ponies, and men who do not. You shall be the second sort. I shall see to it." And then she stood up, silk all over straw, and walked out, and never afterwards mentioned the pony or the matter or her hand on my neck. She has not, in the 18 years since, repeated the sentence. She has not in any sentence since used my name with that softness. But I have remembered it. I think it has, in some respect, run my life. The fire ticked. Imogen was silent. "That is a true thing," she said at last. "Thank you." "Now yours." "Mine." She turned the cup slowly in her hands. "When my father left us, in March of my 19th year, he had no will. He had not, in any year of his life, kept more than £3 at a time about him, because what he did not give the church, he gave the Foundling Hospital. We owed £11 to the butcher, and £4 to the chandler, and 2 to the cobbler." She set the cup down. The fire ticked. She did not look up. "I went, on the day after he was buried, with the £11 I had in a small purse, every penny I had, to the butcher at Stainforth, and I paid him, and I asked him for £1/2 of mutton scrag on credit for my mother's broth. He gave it me. He gave it me without asking." She turned the cup again, once, twice. "I have, since that day, never been able to bear charity that has not first been earned. I had earned that scrag, sir, with the £11 I had not kept for the chandler. But the chandler I paid the next month, and the cobbler the month after, and the butcher I did not ask again. I do not, Edmund, take help that does not feel like a transaction. It is a small ugliness of mine. I know it. I have not been able to mend it. It is not an ugliness. It is. It will, I expect, give us trouble in time." "Us," he said, before he could stop himself. She looked up at him. Her eyes in the firelight were entirely grey and entirely unafraid. "Us, Mr. Carmichael," was the easier word. "I'm going to bed before I say something I have not yet earned the right to say. Good night." "Good night, Mr. Carmichael." He went up the narrow stair to the small guest room above the parlour. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, in the dark, in the borrowed shirt, with his hands on his knees, and he thought about Lady Cordelia Pembroke in her father's London drawing room, and about the signed settlement on the chair by the window. And he did not, for a long time, manage to sleep at all. The Saturday began clear and very cold. Frost on the inside of the windows, the cob's breath in white plumes over the paddock wall. Edmund came down before sunrise to find Imogen already at the bread oven, her face flushed from the heat, a long iron peel in one hand, and a tray of risen loaves on the deal table beside her. "Coffee, Mr. Carmichael, on the hob." "Thank you. And before you ask, yes, I have eaten. No, I have not slept enough. Yes, the cob is fine. No, Tom is not yet awake. Yes, Brennan is in the stable. The wall, sir, is your morning." "The wall is my morning." "Good. Go and fall on the moor in a useful direction." He drank his coffee. He went out to the wall. It was a long, thin section that ran along the paddock, dry stone, perhaps 80 yards, 4 feet high, and the storm had pushed perhaps 15 feet of it onto its side, along a curving stretch where the ground rose. He spent the first half hour selecting his stones, sorting them by size and by the squareness of their faces, and after that, he simply worked. There is a particular pleasure in dry stone walling. The stones have to find one another. The rule, his grandfather had said the first time he had been put to it as a boy, is 1 stone over 2 and 2 over 1. And the second rule is that if you can pull a stone out with one hand, you have built it wrong. He had built it wrong, the first time, 6 times in a row. He had been 7. His grandfather had not been a kind man either, but he had known a wall. By mid-morning, the rebuilt section was 3/4 done. He had stripped off his coat. He had rolled his sleeves to his elbows. His shoulders ached pleasantly. He could hear, faintly, from the inn, Imogen's voice and Tom's voice, and the small particular creak of a barrel being rolled across flags. He looked up at one point, and found her standing on the other side of the wall, watching him. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough. You have, sir, a perfectly competent left hand." "I was apprenticed, briefly, at 14, to my grandfather's drystone waller, a man called Pritchett. He told me he would not be hard on me because I was a duke's grandson, but that he would be very hard on me because I was a boy with a soft mouth. He was hard. Pritchett. There is a Pritchett in the churchyard at Stainforth, who is a Pritchett of those Pritchetts. His son builds wall in the next valley. Small world. Small world." She climbed over the unbroken section of the wall in a way that made him very aware of his hands. She came over to where he stood. She picked up one of the stones he had set aside as too rough, a long, ill-shaped piece with one square end and one curve, and turned it in her hands. "What do you do with this one?" "That one is a through stone. It goes through the wall, end to end, as a tie, 1 every yard. They are the bones." She told him, level and quiet, to show her. When he hesitated, she added that she was, in fact, the freeholder of this wall, and he was therefore obliged to teach her how it stood up. He showed her. He bedded the stone where it belonged, deep through the section, end to end. He took her hand, small surprise of warmth on a cold morning, and laid it against the protruding end. "Feel it. There. That is the bone. The wall stands on those." She did not move her hand for a moment. She kept her hand on the stone. After a long moment, she spoke without looking at him. "You are not, in fact, a man who is afraid of his own hands." "I have not, in fact, used them in a great while." "I am sorry to hear it." "I have decided, in the last 2 days, that I shall use them more in future." She looked at him. She did not, for once, have a reply ready. She drew her hand back. She set it against her own apron pocket. The colour was high in her face. He thought it was not, on this occasion, the bread oven. "More tea at the 11th hour, sir." More tea at the 11th hour. She went back over the wall. He kept on with the bones. By the end of the second day, he had mended the slate, rehung the loose shutter of the front guest room, dug out a blocked drain that had been quietly drowning the kitchen garden, and rebuilt a portion of the dry stone wall along the cob's paddock that the rain had nudged onto its back. Imogen had paid him in bread, cheese, 3 cups of unreasonably good tea, and 1 slice, at supper, of a pear tart she had made from windfalls. He had also, by the end of the second day, learned that she had married John Hartley at 19 because her father, the village schoolmaster, had been taken by a chest fever in March of that year, and her mother had followed in May, and the inn was the only fixed roof she had been offered. John had been kind. John had been 12 years older. John had been not so much a husband as a sturdy elder cousin who occasionally took too much porter on Saturday nights and apologized on Sundays. She had not loved him. She had been fond of him. She missed him without grief, the way you miss a familiar lamp removed from a familiar table. The inn had been left to her clear, but the land it stood on belonged, through a leasehold of 40 years that had 31 more to run, to one Mr. Silas Thorne, a cloth merchant out of Halifax, who had been buying up coaching inns along the North Road for 5 years, with the patience of a man who knew the new turnpike commissioners and what they meant for stage routes. Mr. Thorne had been politely insisting, in writing, for the last 14 months, that Mrs. Hartley sell him the freehold of the inn building and accept a very fair sum that was, by Imogen's quiet reckoning, less than half its worth. She had been politely refusing. Mr. Thorne, in his last letter, had begun using the word regret. She had told him this between the second and third helpings of bean and bacon stew, in a voice that was perfectly level, the way a woman might describe a recurring cough. The way she pronounced the name Mr. Thorne, however, with one small clipped breath at the end of it, gave her away. And does he visit this Mr. Thorne? He has not yet had the discourtesy. Will he? Yes, by the end of the year. He will come and stand in my tap room in his coat, and tell me my own roof is too much for me, and that I am wasting my youth, and I shall offer him tea, and he will refuse, and we shall be very civil, while I find I have no further use for him. And the leasehold renewal? In 9 years. He need only wait. But Mr. Thorne is not a patient man. He has spent 5 years buying inns. He thinks the new turnpike will bring 8 coaches a day past my door by spring. He wants to be the man who collects the fees. Will it? Possibly. The Commissioner's map shows the new road through Stainforth. The old road, this road, will be left to the moor. If that comes to pass, I will lose 4 coaches a week, and gain only the local farmers. The White Stag will become a public house with rooms above, not an inn. The difference, Mr. Carmichael, is the difference between a living and a long, thin starving. He had set down his spoon. He had watched her across the candle. She had buttered a piece of bread and eaten it without looking up. If you needed, Mr. Carmichael, do not finish that sentence. You are very kind. You will sleep here 3 more nights. You will mend my roof and my wall. You will be charming to my stable boy and unforgiving with my cob. And on Tuesday morning you will leave, and you will go home to your estate near Helmsley, and you will not write to me, and you will not send me money, and you will not arrive on a horse one rainy afternoon in March with a leather case and a solution. Because I am not, sir, a problem you are going to solve. I am a woman keeping a house, the way 10,000 women keep 10,000 houses. And I have managed mine for 2 years without help, and I will manage it for 9 more. Are we clear? He had agreed that they were extraordinarily clear. He had asked, after a small pause, whether he might have more stew. She had passed him the dish. The candle had guttered. He had looked across it and thought, my God. My God, but she would have been wasted on me in a London drawing room. We would have been wasted on each other. He had thought, but not said, that he wasn't yet a man on a horse with a leather case and a solution. He was a man on a roof with a sack of slates and 3 days to think. The third morning began with Mr. Silas Thorne. Edmund was halfway up the ladder again, finishing the cap of the chimney, when Tom came skidding around the side of the stable with his eyes the size of communion plates. "Mr. Carmichael, sir. There's a gent at the front door wants the missus. Black coat, London hat. Says he's expected." Edmund came down the ladder slowly. He set the pail on the bench. He brushed dust off his sleeves. He could hear, faintly, a man's voice inside the taproom, measured, smooth, with the small, comfortable nasal of West Riding industry, overlaid with bought education. He stepped into the passage by the kitchen and stood where he could hear without being seen. "Mrs. Hartley." The voice was warm and entirely without warmth. "I shall not waste your morning. I've come up from Halifax. I have a man with me in the trap. He is, as it happens, the very wheelwright your unfortunate guest will need on Tuesday, and I have engaged him for the rest of the week on my own business in Stainforth. He cannot, regrettably, be spared. Now, Mr. Thorne, I have a paper here that, signed today, would settle everything between us. The sum is generous. You would not work again. You could go to your sister in York, take a small house, live well. I will give you a moment to read." "I do not need a moment, Mr. Thorne. I have read the figure on previous occasions. It has not improved. Mrs. Hartley, let us be plain. This house is too much for one woman." "This house is precisely enough for one woman, Mr. Thorne. It is, on the contrary, you who appear to find it too much. The new turnpike, Mr. Thorne, has not been built. The commissioners have not voted. 2 of them, by my last information, are very fond of the trout in the river that runs past my back paddock. The map you carry in your pocket is a map drawn by a draftsman, not a road laid down by men." There was a small, clean pause. "Mr. Thorne, you will take your trap and your wheelwright and your generous figure, and you will go back down the road to Halifax, and you will come again in the spring if you must, and I shall offer you tea again, and you shall refuse again, and we shall be civil again. Good morning." There was a small silence inside the taproom. Edmund pressed his shoulder against the cold whitewash of the passage wall and closed his eyes. "You should know, Mrs. Hartley," Thorne said, very gently, "that the leasehold contains certain covenants concerning maintenance and condition. The roof, for example. Should the inn fall into disrepair, the freeholder retains rights of, let us call it, accelerated review. I should be sorry to invoke them." "You should be sorry, Mr. Thorne, for many things. The roof is sound. The drains are clear. The wall along the Cobb's paddock was rebuilt this Tuesday." She said Tuesday, as though it had been Tuesday and not yesterday. "Should you wish to send a surveyor, I shall make him very welcome. He may inspect every joist. He will find nothing." "How fortunate," Thorne said softly, "that you have a gentleman in residence to assist with the upkeep. One hopes he is a long stayer." "He is a paying guest, Mr. Thorne, as you are not. Good morning." The door opened. The door closed. There was the sound of wheels turning in the wet yard, and the wet thwack of a whip, and the sound of the wheels diminishing down the road in the direction of Halifax. Edmund stepped out of the passage into the taproom. Imogen was standing very still at the bar. Her hands were braced flat on the polished wood. Her knuckles were white. "I heard," he said. "I supposed." "I am sorry." "Don't be. You did not bring him." "He saw my coat in the entry." "He saw what he was always going to see. He is not a stupid man. He merely wishes I were." Imogen. It was the first time he had used her name. He had not meant to. It came out of his mouth as if he had been saying it privately for 2 days, and the syllables had simply tired of being kept indoors. She lifted her head. "Mrs. Hartley," she said gently. "We are not. Yet." I would like very much to be of some use to you in this. If only to call on the magistrate at Helmsley. If only to write to a friend in the Commissioner's office. If only— "Mr. Carmichael." Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "What did I say last night? About a horse and a leather case and an afternoon in March?" "You said no." "I said no." "You said no to that. You did not say no to a friend writing a letter." She looked at him for a long moment. "What sort of friend writes letters to the Turnpike Commissioners?" "A friend with connections." "A Mr. Carmichael of London, on business, with connections to the West Yorkshire Turnpike Commissioners." "Yes, Mrs. Hartley." "Who are you?" The taproom had gone very quiet. The fire ticked. Outside, somewhere in the paddock, the cob blew through her nose. The leather case with the marriage settlement was on the chair by the window. He had been carrying it from room to room for 3 days, like a child carries a doll. "I am," Edmund said carefully, "a man who would, if you allowed it, write to the commissioners on your behalf and ask them very politely to keep the road where the road has always been." "That is not an answer." "It is the only one I can give you this morning." "Then I do not require the letter, Mr. Carmichael." He spoke her name into the room. "No, sir. If I am to take help from a man, I will take it from a man, not from his connections. Good morning. There is still half a chimney to finish." He climbed back up the ladder. He finished the chimney. He thought about Cordelia Pembroke for the first time in 2 days, and he did not like what he thought. He came down at dusk with his shoulders aching and his hair full of mortar. Imogen was nowhere in the taproom. Brennan was rubbing down the cob. "She's in the orchard, sir." "How long have you been with me?" 9 years, sir. 3 months. "Have I ever, in those 9 years and 3 months, asked your advice on a personal matter?" "No, sir." "Then please listen to me without giving any. I am in considerable difficulty." "I am aware, sir." "It is not, in fact, the chaise." "No, sir." "Sir? How quickly can you have the cob harnessed to a saddle and on the road south at first light Monday morning?" "By the second cockcrow, sir." "Good. Then we leave Monday at first light. I will go ahead on the cob, and you and the chaise will follow as soon as the wheelwright permits. I have an errand in London I had not, 3 days ago, anticipated requiring." Brennan paused in his rubbing. He set the brush down. He looked at Edmund. "Sir," he said, "may I, without giving advice, observe?" "You may observe." "The lady in the orchard, sir, has not, in the 3 days, looked at you the way she looks at the cob, the bread oven, or me. She has looked at you, if your grace will forgive me, the way my late mother looked at my father, the day before she said yes to him. You have observed. Thank you." Edmund walked out across the wet yard and around the side of the inn and through the small wicker gate into the orchard. She was on a low stone bench under one of the apple trees, with her knees drawn up under her skirts and a small flat book open on her lap and a strand of hair across her cheek. The light was the long, low gold of a Yorkshire October evening, and it caught on the curve of her throat and the line of her collarbone in a way he had seen earlier and intended, then, never to think of again. She did not look up as he came through the gate. She turned a page. "I leave at first light on Monday." A pause. She turned another page. She had not, he thought, taken in a word of it. "Monday. I have business in London I had thought to delay. I find I cannot." "Indeed." I should like to come back." When the business is concluded. She closed the book. I do not, in fact, take in lodgers between Tuesday and the spring. The road is closed too often. The stag becomes very dull. There is no business here to come back to. I am not coming back for business. Then what, sir, are you coming back for? For you. The single word landed in the orchard like a stone in a still pool. The light was gold. The apples on the grass were wet. Somewhere over the wall a pigeon got up, clattering out of an ash tree, and was gone. She set the book carefully on the bench beside her. You do not even know me, Mr. Carmichael. He knew, he said slowly, that she had the same hand his grandmother had had with comfrey. He knew that she read in the orchard. He knew that she laughed once a week and apologized for it afterwards. He knew that she bandaged a stranger's hand without looking at him, because if she had looked at him while she did it, she would have been obliged to acknowledge that he was a stranger, and she had not, for that minute, wished him to be one. He knew that she had said no to £700 offered by a man in a London hat in her own taproom that morning, and that her hands had shaken only afterwards. He knew, he said, that he would not, after Monday, be the same man who had come up her steps in the rain. She did not answer at once. The pigeon over the wall had gone. A second one took its place and was as quickly gone. She said his name as he had given it to her, and then asked him to stop. She said, very carefully, that he was not who he had said he was. No, he said. She had known, she told him, since the first night. Brennan had called him Your Grace that morning. The cob had a saddle blanket in the stable, embroidered with a coronet over a C. The wax seal on his leather case was impressed with a coat of arms. She was not, she said, a stupid woman. She had not asked because he had not wished her to. Because he had wished, she thought, to be a man with mortar in his hair, in a borrowed shirt, in her taproom. And she had let him. For 3 days. She had let herself also. He sat down on the bench beside her, not touching, 2 paces of bench between them. Will you let me say it now? He was Edmund Carmichael, he said. He was also Edmund, 8th Duke of Carmichael. His estate was at Carmichael Hall near Helmsley. He had 700 tenants, 1 elderly mother, a great deal of debt, and, until Monday morning, a signed settlement of marriage with Lady Cordelia Pembroke of London. She did not move. And on Monday morning? On Monday morning, he told her, he would go to London, and he would break it. Why? Because, he said, the lady was in love with another man. Because he did not love her. Because he never could have, even before 3 days ago. Because to honor a promise made for the wrong reason, at the cost of every other promise a man might keep, was not honor. It was cowardice in a coat. She asked then about the 700 tenants, the debt. They would be borne, he said, as they were going to be borne, by him, by Carmichael, not by Lady Cordelia's father's purse. There were other ways. There were always other ways for a man with a roof and a head and time. He had forgotten. And then? And then, he said, he would come back here, on a horse, with no leather case, in March if she wished, or April, or whenever she said, and he would ask her, properly, for the privilege of paying his own way, with her, for the rest of his life. He would not buy her in. He would not solve Mr. Thorne. He would write the letter she did not wish him to write, quietly, on his own account, because he could not help being a man who had the friends he had. But he would not save her, Imogen. He had watched her save herself for 3 days. He should be honored only to keep the kettle on while she did it. She turned her head. Her grey eyes were full of something he could not, in the gold of the evening, quite name. You have, she said, rehearsed that. I have. Twice, since this morning. On the chimney. It is... Better than I had any right to expect, from a London man in soft boots. May I? No, not yet. Monday first. London first. The letter you must write to that poor girl first. And then March. And then we shall see. And then we shall see, he repeated. She picked up the book and opened it again. She did not, he noticed, turn the page. You ought to go in, she said. It will be dark soon. There is mutton. There is always mutton. It is a coaching inn, Edmund. Mutton is what we are for. He stood. He walked a step. He stopped. Thank you. For the shirt. And the salve. And the bench. And the 3 days. Edmund, we are past Mr. Carmichael, surely. Edmund, go in. He went in. Sunday passed in a kind of suspended, careful peace. They did not, by silent agreement, speak again of London, or Carmichael, or Cordelia, or Thorn. He finished the wall. He chopped wood. She baked. They ate. They sat by the fire after Brennan and Tom had gone to bed, and she read a few pages of a small, calf-bound volume aloud to him, a county history that was less dull than it sounded, and he watched her mouth shape the place names of villages he had never visited, and thought, with a clarity he had not had at any point in his earlier life, this, here, this is the shape of it. At first light on Monday, Brennan brought the cob round saddled. Imogen stood on the steps of the inn in a grey shawl, pulled tight against the cold, her dark hair pinned cleanly. No laughter in her face, but no farewell in it either. Only the level grey expectancy of a woman who had decided to believe a man, for as long as it took him to prove her wrong. He took her hand. He pressed his mouth to the back of it, where the small, thin scar of an old kitchen burn ran from the base of her thumb to her wrist. He did not speak. She did not. He swung up. He turned the cob. He looked back once at the small grey inn with the swinging sign and the woman on its step. And then he kicked the cob into a steady trot and was gone down the road south, away from the moor, towards London, towards the very particular promise he had, 3 days ago, thought he would walk through fire to keep, and now intended to break with his own hand by Friday week. He stopped on the road twice. He stopped at midday at a small wayside inn at Borough Bridge, where the landlord knew him as Mr. Carmichael from the previous summer and did not ask him questions. And he ate cold ham at a window table and watched the road run south through low hedges already half stripped of their leaves. The leather case was on the bench beside him. He had not opened it. The settlement was inside it. So was a small thing he had not, 3 days ago, possessed. A folded square of plain linen, with a brown stain on it where Imogen had pressed his cut palm. He had not, when he was tying his saddlebags at first light, intended to bring it. He had put it in the case as he reached for the case, and now it was in London with him in his pocket. He stopped at evening at a posting inn at Doncaster, where he was not known by anyone. He took a small room at the back. He wrote out, that night, by the candle on the rickety table, 3 drafts of what he meant to say to Lady Cordelia Pembroke, and burned each of them in the candle's flame, and lay awake until 2 in the morning, composing a 4th, which he did not, in the end, write down, because he had decided that to read it from a paper would be to do her, again, the discourtesy of treating her as a problem. He reached London on the Wednesday afternoon. He went first to his own house in Grosvenor Square, closed, dust-sheeted, the under-butler in shirt-sleeves astonished to see him, and he washed and changed into clean linen and put on his only black coat and his only black gloves, and he sat for 10 minutes in the cold drawing-room, looking at his father's portrait on the wall. His father, in oils, in middle age, in a coat painted by an artist who had been told to flatter and had done his honest best, looked back at him with an expression Edmund had spent most of his life trying not to inherit. It was an expression that said, "I have done what was expected of me, and I have paid for it, and I expect you to pay for it also." "No," Edmund said, aloud, in the quiet of the drawing room. "Not, in fact, this evening." He stood up. He took his hat and his gloves. He walked to Bruton Street. The Pembroke house in Bruton Street had a black and white tiled hall, a footman who had known Edmund since he was 20, and a butler, Greaves, who looked at the Duke's 3 days mud-spattered greatcoat and made the small, clean facial adjustment of a man who had decided not to have an opinion about it. "Your Grace, Lord Pembroke is in the morning room. Lady Cordelia, I believe, is—" "I should like to see Lady Cordelia first, Greaves. Alone, privately, in the small drawing room, if she will." A very small pause. "I shall inquire, Your Grace." He waited in the hall under the chandelier with his hat in his hand. The dukedom's signet ring was back on his finger. He had not worn it for 4 days. It felt heavier than he remembered. Cordelia came down the stairs in a morning gown of dove silk, with a shawl over her arm and her colour high and her hands not steady. She was 19. She was very pretty. She was the daughter of 3 baronies and 1 ironworks. She was, at this moment, more afraid than he had ever seen a woman afraid in a drawing room, and he understood for the first time in 3 months of acquaintance how much he had not, in fact, been paying any attention to her at all. "Your Grace." He asked her, gently, to sit, and to allow him to speak first. She sat. She arranged her hands. She unarranged them. She said yes in a voice he could barely hear. He sat in the chair opposite hers and leant forward with his elbows on his knees and told her, plainly, that he had come to ask her to release him from their engagement. The silence in the small drawing room was complete for perhaps 4 seconds. He watched her face. He watched a series of expressions cross it that he did not, in that moment, have the experience to read. Disbelief. Fear. A kind of guarded hope. And then, and this was the one that startled him, relief. Pure, bright, almost unguarded relief, like a child who has just been told the lesson is over an hour early. Then the relief vanished into terror, and she put her hand to her throat. "Edmund, you cannot!" He could, he told her. He would. He took all responsibility on himself. Her father and the world would be told that he had failed in some respect of character or means to be a suitable match. He would write it himself. He would sign it. There would be no question of any want on her side. She would have the sympathy of every drawing room in London. She tried to speak of her father, of the iron concern, the loans he had made against the marriage. He had made loans against expectations, Edmund said. Expectations were a thing a man might take back. Edmund would lend him, privately, what he required to cover his immediate obligations, without interest, against the security of the ironworks alone, not against her. Her mouth opened. She closed it. She put both hands flat on the silk of her skirt. "Why?" He looked at her, properly, perhaps for the first time. Her thin neck, the set of her mouth, the way her hands had stopped trembling because he had told her she could go. Because, he said, he had in the last 3 days been forced, by an axle and a storm and a woman with a poker, to sit in a kitchen and look at his life. He had seen that to marry her for the reasons he had meant to marry her would be a discourtesy of a kind no settlement, however generous, could repair. She deserved to be married for the woman she actually was, not for the alliance she represented. And whoever the man was that she actually loved, and he had suspected since a small assembly at Whitechapel last August that there was such a man. She made a small sound. Deserved, he finished gently, to be allowed to come forward and ask for her on his own merits. He is not. Cordelia, tell me his name, privately, in this room, so that I may, if you ask it, speak well of him to your father when the time comes. She was crying now, very quietly, without shaking. Her hands were over her face. "Mr. Pellew," she whispered. "James Pellew. He is my father's secretary. He has been for 2 years. He has not. I have not let him, but he—" Mr. Pellew. Edmund had met him. A grave, intelligent young man with a careful waistcoat and a way of looking once at Cordelia at the dinner table and then not again for the rest of the evening. "I have always liked Mr. Pellew." "Edmund, Cordelia. You shall have him if you wish him. I shall speak to your father today. We shall manage the world together. Now." He reached into his coat and drew out the leather case, and from the leather case the oilcloth, and from the oilcloth the folded settlement, and he laid it on the small mahogany table between them. "May I have your permission to consign this document to the fire?" "Yes," she whispered. He stood. He crossed to the fireplace. He laid the settlement on the coals. The wax seal hissed. The paper curled. The handwriting, his own, 3 days old, blackened and was gone. He turned back to her. "Now," he said, more gently, "shall we go and ruin your father's morning together?" She gave a small, wet laugh. "Yes, Your Grace." "Edmund, please." Lord Pembroke received them in the morning room. Lord Pembroke did not enjoy his morning. Lord Pembroke, by 11:30, had been induced, through a combination of Edmund's quiet refusal to lose his temper, his private undertaking concerning the ironworks loan, and Cordelia's small, steady declaration that she would not, in fact, ever sign her name to the contract, to accept, with a colour high in his neck, the new arrangement. Lord Pembroke did, in the morning room, attempt outrage. He attempted it for perhaps 7 minutes. He stood by the window with his hands behind his back and informed Edmund, very precisely, that the engagement had been printed in the Gazette, that the dowry had been transferred in 3 tranches between the bank and his solicitors, that there were 6 warehouses in the East India Docks whose tenants had been promised a connection to Carmichael's borrowing facility in March, and that to break this off now was to undo the work of 2 years, and to ruin, by his estimate, 11 separate gentlemen's reputations, including his own. Edmund had let him say all of it. He had stood very straight beside the cold fireplace, with his hands clasped at his back and his eyes on a point above the mantel. He had not interrupted. He had watched the small painted clock on the chimney-piece move through nearly 7 full minutes, while Lord Pembroke walked his anger up and down the length of the room and back again, and he had thought, very steadily, about a woman with a poker in a doorway in a storm, and about how anger looked when it had nowhere to go. When Lord Pembroke had at last run out of breath, Edmund had spoken in the same level tone he had used in Imogen's tap-room, telling her his name. He had not come, he said, to break a contract. He had come to be released from one that, by Lord Pembroke's own daughter's words to him not half an hour earlier in this same house, she did not consent to and did not wish. He would, on his own account, before the end of the week, place at Lord Pembroke's disposal, privately, without interest, against the security of the ironworks alone, whatever sum was required to cover the warehouses, the tranches, and the 11 gentlemen. He would do this not because he owed it. He owed Lord Pembroke nothing. He would do it because he owed it to Cordelia to leave her father in such a condition that she might, when she took a man of her own choosing, do so without his ruin on her conscience. The colour in Lord Pembroke's neck climbed. He would not, Edmund said quietly, when Lord Pembroke began to bluster a refusal. Refuse. He was too sensible a man. They had, this morning, 3 things to consider between them. The daughter who did not wish to marry him, the secretary, Mr. Pellew, whom Edmund could vouch for as a man of substance enough in himself to be entrusted with her, and the warehouses. If they proceeded with Edmund's proposal, the daughter was permitted to be happy, the secretary to be honourable, and the warehouses to be liquid. If they did not, all three remained at risk. They were not, he said gently, in any actual disagreement. Lord Pembroke was, for nearly half a minute, silent. Cordelia, sitting very still on the small green settee beside the fender, did not lift her eyes. Edmund watched a small clock on the chimney-piece tick. Somewhere in the back of the house, a door shut. "Your Grace," Lord Pembroke said at last, "you are not the man your father was." "No, my lord. I am working very hard, on the contrary, not to be." Lord Pembroke nodded, slowly, once. He rang the bell. Greaves brought coffee. They sat down to consider the warehouses. He sat down. He drank the coffee. He stayed 3 hours. By the time he left Bruton Street at 2:30 in the afternoon, a draft letter had been agreed concerning the warehouses, the form of his withdrawal from the engagement, the form of the Pellew engagement to be announced the 3rd Tuesday following, the private loan in respect of the ironworks, and the precise tone in which the Pembroke household was to speak of the Duke of Carmichael in any drawing-room that asked. Cordelia, on the doorstep, had taken both of his hands in hers and pressed them once and said, "Thank you, Your Grace," in a voice he had not previously heard her use, the voice of a woman who has just been given back her own life. "Be good to him, Cordelia. Mr. Pellew." "I shall. Be good. Be good to her. The lady whose stockings you are not, on this evidence, wearing in town." He had given her a small, startled look. She had smiled, the first real smile he had ever seen on her. "Your Grace, a woman knows. I do not require her name, only that you go back to her and put it on a proper footing. Promise me." "I promise you." "Then we are quits." He had supper that night with his mother. He had sent her word from Grosvenor Square at 4 o'clock. She had sent back, by way of the same footman, a single line in her own hand. "I expect you at 8. Wear the dark coat." The Carmichael London house was Berkeley Square, 3 streets away. He walked. The lamps were being lit. The night was clear and cold. The Dowager Duchess of Carmichael received him in her own drawing-room, sitting very upright in a small, straight-backed chair by the fire, in her usual grey, with her usual cap, and her usual rings. She was 61. She had been, in her youth, a beauty of some note in the courts of 2 German princes. She was, by general report in London, the most coldly intelligent woman of her generation. "Sit, there, not on the silk, the brown chair." He sat in the brown chair. She poured him a small glass of Madeira and pushed it across the table to him without looking at him. "I am told," she said, "that you have spent the morning in Bruton Street being a fool." "You are well informed." "I am always well informed. I am also told you have spent the previous week in a small inn on the moor, north of Helmsley, being a different sort of fool." "You are even better informed than I had supposed." "Greaves writes to me, Edmund. He has written to me, on confidential terms, every Monday morning for the last 11 years. I pay him 8 guineas a year. He is excellent value. He is also rather fond of you, and considers it part of his duty to keep me apprised of the worst of your moods. Now, tell me, without theatrics, what have you done?" He told her. He left nothing out. He told her about the cracked axle, the lantern in the doorway, the borrowed shirt, the bandaged hand, the bay mare, the wall, the orchard, the bench, Mr. Silas Thorne. He told her about Cordelia and Mr. Pellew, and the warehouses, and the loan. He told her about the freehold he had instructed his solicitors that morning, on his way to dinner, to begin purchasing. He told her about the rebuilt chimney, and the slate roof, and the dry stone wall, and his grandfather's man, Pritchett. She listened. She did not interrupt. When he had finished, she sat very still for what felt like a great while, looking at a small painted screen in the corner of the room, which had been her wedding present from a sister 30 years gone. Yes, Mamma. Is she beautiful? Yes, Mamma. Is she sensible? Yes, Mamma, more than I am. Will she manage a dukedom? She will manage it. She will refuse to be managed by it. She will keep an inn on the side of it, because she is, in fact, an excellent innkeeper, and she will refuse to be made to feel that the inn is a hobby. I am not, on this, in disagreement with her. You are not? No, Mamma. Will she make you happy? She has already, Mamma, made me less of a fool than I was a fortnight ago. I cannot, on this evidence, ask her to make me more. The Dowager Duchess of Carmichael set her glass down on the small table at her elbow. She arranged her rings. She looked, at last, full at her son. Edmund, she said, in a voice he had not heard her use since he was 9 years old in a loose box with a pony. There are men who break ponies, and men who do not. You are, at last, the second sort. He could not, for a moment, speak. I shall write to her on Wednesday, by name, with proper form, requesting the pleasure of her acquaintance. I shall make no demand of her. I shall arrive at Carmichael Hall for Easter, and not before. You shall ride north on a horse, not in the carriage, because women of that sort respond better to evidence of effort than to evidence of expenditure. Now finish your Madeira. There is partridge. He finished his Madeira. He stayed until midnight. He walked back to Grosvenor Square through Berkeley Square and across Hyde Park in the cold, under a moon the colour of a tarnished sovereign. And he thought, very steadily, that there were perhaps half a dozen moments in a man's life at which he was permitted to alter every prior judgment he had made about the people closest to him. This had been one. He intended, in future, not to waste them. By the end of the week, the gossip in London was managed. The Duke of Carmichael had withdrawn from his engagement to Lady Cordelia Pembroke on the grounds of his own unworthiness. He had been observed to behave like a gentleman about it. He had been seen in the company of Lord Pembroke at the club 2 days later in apparent civility. The ironworks had received a private loan from an unnamed source. Lady Cordelia was, by the end of the month, very quietly betrothed to a Mr. James Pellew, of no fortune to speak of, and an excellent, steady character. The town said many things. The town always did. Edmund did not, on the whole, listen. What Edmund did, in those 3 weeks in London, between the burning of the settlement and the day he turned the Cobb north again, was. He wrote, in his own hand, to 2 of the West Riding Turnpike commissioners, gentlemen he had known at Eton and Cambridge respectively, and asked them, very politely, to consider the merits of the old North Road through the moor versus the new proposed line through Stainforth, and noted, in passing, the particular regard in which the trout stream at the 2nd milepost was held by a certain Sir Richard Carstairs, and the inconvenience that would attend its diversion. He did not mention the White Stag. He did not need to. He wrote, secondly, to a firm of solicitors in York, and instructed them, very quietly, to obtain by purchase from a Mr. Silas Thorne the freehold of the land beneath an inn known as the White Stag, on the Old North Road, on any reasonable terms, with the strict condition that the existence and identity of the buyer were never on any account to be communicated to the leaseholder. He then instructed them, on receipt of the freehold, to convert the leasehold into a freehold outright, in the name of Mrs. Imogen Hartley, widow, of the same address, as the gift of an anonymous well-wisher, with no further conditions attached, and no expectation of any communication on the subject. He paid, for this transaction, more than the Pembroke settlement would have brought in. It was, he reflected, the cheapest thing he had ever bought. He wrote, thirdly, to his mother. The Dowager Duchess of Carmichael read the letter twice, set it on the table beside her teacup, and remarked to her companion, Mrs. Welby, that her son appeared at last, at the age of 27, to be turning into someone she might, in time, enjoy knowing. She wrote back a careful and forgiving reply, containing exactly one piece of advice, which was that he should arrive at the inn on a horse he had ridden himself, rather than in a carriage, because women who had spent 2 years alone in a windy moor inn responded better to evidence of effort than to evidence of expenditure. He read it twice and laughed. He did not, in those 3 weeks, write to Imogen. She had not asked him to. He thought she would not have read it. He waited until the first week of November, when the moor would be hardening with frost, and the air over Hampstead Heath in the mornings smelled of wood smoke, and the year had decisively turned. Then he packed a single saddlebag, sent Brennan ahead by coach with very particular instructions concerning a certain wheelwright and a certain Mr. Thorne, and rode north on his own horse, a grey gelding called Quintus, sound in the wind and unsentimental about weather, and the start of the second week of November, 3 weeks and 4 days after he had ridden south on Imogen Hartley's cob. He reached Helmsley on the Saturday. He slept at Carmichael Hall on the Saturday night for the first time in nearly 5 months, and went round his own estate at dawn on Sunday with his steward, and discovered that the place had not, in fact, fallen down in his absence, and that the new drainage scheme in the West Fields had taken better than he had dared hope. He breakfasted with his mother, who said almost nothing, and looked at him over the marmalade with a kind of dry approval he had not seen on her face since he was 14. On the Monday, very early, he rode out from Carmichael Hall on Quintus with no leather case, no signet ring on the outside of his glove, no greatcoat tailored at Weston's, only a plain travelling coat, a pair of saddlebags, and the same borrowed wool stockings of John Hartley's that he had, for reasons he could not entirely account for, never returned. He rode southwest across the moor for most of the day. By the time he came over the rise of the second milepost, he could see, ahead of him in a low fold of the road, the small grey shape of the inn with the painted sign. And he could see, even at this distance, 2 things that brought the hair up on his arms in spite of himself. The first was that the painted stag on the sign had been repainted. The white was brighter. The green field beneath was a clean, fresh green. Somebody had taken the gilt brush to the lettering at last. The second was that the front door was standing open, and a man in a black coat and a London hat was walking down the steps with a quick, angry stride, climbing into a waiting trap and turning the trap south down the road at a pace that suggested his morning had not gone as planned. Mr. Silas Thorne, Edmund thought. Yes, good morning to you, Mr. Thorne. He let Quintus walk the last quarter mile. When he came up the last yards of road and turned through the gate of the yard, Imogen was standing on the steps of the inn, with an apron tied over a clean grey dress and a folded paper in her hand, and an expression he had not, in 3 days under her roof, ever quite seen on her face. It was an expression that he understood, after a moment, to be the expression of a woman who had just been told, in her own taproom, by the freeholder of her land, that the freehold of her land had been bought out from under him by an anonymous purchaser, that the new freehold had been conveyed to her in fee simple, that she now owned, outright and entire, the only house she had ever called her own, and who had a fair idea exactly which Mr. Carmichael of London on business with connections was, at this present moment, riding up her drive on a grey horse. She did not move from the step. He swung off. He led Quintus to the rail. He looped the rein. He took off his hat. He climbed the 2 stone steps until he was standing 1 step below her, which put their eyes very nearly level. Your Grace. Edmund, we had agreed. Edmund, we had also agreed. She lifted the folded paper. That you would not buy my inn. I did not buy your inn. He had bought the freehold of the land beneath it, he said, from a man who did not deserve to be permitted to hold it any longer. He had then given that freehold, entire, to its rightful owner, without his name on it. The inn had always been hers. The land was now also hers. He had not bought her anything she did not already, by every measure of decency, own. He had only bought back from a vulgar Halifax merchant a piece of ordinary justice. You are speaking like a man who has rehearsed this also. I have. On the road. Most of yesterday. It is better than the orchard. Only just. I should like, very much, to know whether you mean to throw the contents of that paper into the fire, and the contents of me out of the yard. Because if you do, I shall ride away without complaint, and you will have your inn, and your land, and your independence, and never see me again. And if you do not... Imogen, I have ridden a grey horse from London with John Hartley's stockings on my legs, and a question I have not even rehearsed in my mouth, because I could not bring myself to rehearse it, in case the rehearsing of it spoiled it. So I will ask it plainly. Ask it. Would she marry him? Not because he was a duke, not because she required the protection of a name, not because Mr. Thorne would return in February. He would not. The new freeholder had seen to that. Would she marry him, Imogen Hartley, because the two of them, for 3 days in October, in a borrowed shirt and a borrowed bench and a borrowed bandage, had been the closest to themselves either of them had been in a very long time. And because he did not, on consideration, wish to be anywhere else for the rest of his life than wherever she was putting the kettle on. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked down at the folded paper. She looked back at him. Edmund Carmichael. You did not, in fact, ask my permission to be the anonymous well-wisher. I did not. You bought a freehold and gave it to me without my consent. I did. I am, on this point, not contrite. I am rather proud of myself. That is not at all how I told you it was to be. I know. I am, again, not contrite. I judged that on this single matter your terms required, with very great respect, to be overruled. I will not do it again. On any other matter, you will set the terms, and I will keep to them, with a fidelity that will surprise us both. You will not save me again. I will not save you again. I will keep the kettle on while you save yourself. I will write letters to commissioners about trout streams when it is required. I will mend the slate. I will sleep in the small guest room above the parlour for as long as you require it, and not a day less. I will not, however, on this very particular question of the freehold, apologize. Mr. Thorne is an ass. She made a sound that was, possibly, half a laugh. Mr. Thorne is an ass. He is, Imogen. Will you? She tucked the folded paper into her apron. She came down 1 step. She stood on the same step as him. She put her hand, the one with the small, thin scar that ran from the base of her thumb to her wrist, against his cheek. Yes, she said. On terms. On terms. We will live half the year here, at the Stag. I am not, Edmund, ceasing to be an innkeeper. I am very good at it. You are entirely correct. You are. And half the year at Carmichael, because the 700 tenants will require their duchess in March and at harvest, and your mother will require her in between. My mother has already requested, in writing, the pleasure of your acquaintance. And we will not, you and I, be the kind of people who pretend that the inn is a hobby and the dukedom is the real life. They will both be real life. They will both be real life. And I shall keep my still room in both houses. You shall keep your still room in both houses, and a third one in London, if you wish. And, Edmund, you may, this once, kiss me, on the step. He did. He had been ducal about a great many things in his life, and he was not, in that moment, ducal about anything at all. He was Edmund Carmichael, in John Hartley's wool stockings, on the second stone step of the White Stag, kissing the woman he had walked 500 miles south, and 3 weeks of London drawing-rooms, and 1 burning marriage settlement, to be permitted to kiss. And somewhere over the back paddock, in the cold blue November air, a single rook beat slowly westward against an ordinary wind. They were married very quietly in the church at Stainforth 6 weeks later, before Christmas, before the new snow. The Dowager Duchess of Carmichael attended, in a dove-grey pelisse, and pronounced the bride, afterwards, to her companion, Mrs. Welby, to be the only sensible woman my son has ever brought home, and I include in that judgment Welby, his nurse. Brennan, who had been promoted to under-steward of Carmichael Hall by special arrangement, gave the bride away, because her own father had been a long time gone, and Brennan, in the 4 months of the courtship, had taken the question of her unaccompanied state extremely personally. He cried at the altar, with a quiet dignity that he denied, afterwards, on his life. Tom the stable lad, who was now 13 and immortal, carried the bride's bouquet through the village in a small ceremonial procession of his own devising, involving the cob, 2 lanterns, and a borrowed silk ribbon. He was paid in pear tart for a year. Mr. Silas Thorne, on receipt of the news of the marriage by way of the announcement in the York Gazette, sent a very stiff letter of congratulation, enclosing a piece of plate, which Imogen returned with a polite note, thanking him for the gesture, and informing him that the inn was not, in fact, in need of further silver. The new turnpike, when the commissioners voted on it the following spring, was routed not through Stainforth, but back along the Old North Road. Sir Richard Carstairs' trout, it transpired, were inviolate. A year and a half later, late spring, a warm afternoon, the apples in bloom in the orchard at the White Stag, Imogen was at the deal table in the kitchen, with her sleeves turned back to her elbows, and her hands wrist-deep in a great, soft, pale dome of bread dough, kneading. Edmund stood in the doorway, with a small, dark-haired infant of some 4 months, named Anne, asleep on his shoulder, and he watched her hands at their work, the curve of her wrist, the lift of her shoulder, the strand of dark hair already escaping from her pins to rest against the side of her throat. And he thought, with a clarity that had not left him since the morning he had ridden up her drive on a grey horse, about the first time he had ever seen her, in a lantern's gold, in a doorway, in a storm, with a poker. She glanced up. She caught him looking. She did not, this time, apologize for being seen. "Mrs. Carmichael." "The bread will not knead itself." "It will not." "And our daughter will not, on present evidence, wake until she is hungry." "She is, I am told, very like her mother." "Come and put the kettle on." He came and put the kettle on. He set Anne down in the small basket by the fire. He stood beside his wife at the deal table in the lime-washed kitchen, lined with jars, and laid his hand, briefly, over hers in the dough. Her hand was warm. The dough was warmer. Through the open window over the kitchen garden, a thrush was working at a song in the apple tree. Outside, on the painted sign over the front door of the inn, in newly gilt letters that caught the late spring sun, the words, "The White Stag," hung straight and bright against a clean green field. And the white stag on it looked, if a painted stag could be said to look anything at all, like a creature that had at last, after some long, uncertain journey across a stormy moor, come quietly home.